How does the wisest man to ever live lose everything? King Solomon had it all. Unmatched wisdom, riches beyond imagination, and a kingdom at peace. But what if I told you that this man, blessed by God himself, fell so far from grace that his legacy ended in tragedy? Yeah, you heard me right. Solomon's downfall was nothing short of shocking. At the start of his reign, Solomon was unstoppable. When God came to him in a dream and asked, "What do you want?" Solomon could have asked for anything: power, wealth, the destruction of his enemies. But no, Solomon asked for something that would set him apart forever: wisdom. And because of that one choice, Solomon became a living legend. This guy wrote thousands of proverbs, judged Israel with such brilliance that his decisions left people speechless. You remember the famous cut the baby in half story, right? That's Solomon-level wisdom. He was admired all across the ancient world, and Israel was flourishing like never before. But here's the thing: as wise as Solomon was, even he couldn't escape one of humanity's greatest weaknesses: temptation. Because while Solomon was solving the world's problems, his own heart, it was slowly slipping into darkness. You see, Solomon didn't just take any old wives. He married foreign women, hundreds of them, and with them came their gods. Slowly but surely, Solomon began to drift. The same king who built God's temple in Jerusalem was now building altars for gods like Molech and Chemosh. Yeah, that Molech. The one worshipped with child sacrifices. It's hard to believe, right? The wisest man in the world led his own kingdom into idol worship. And you're probably thinking, wait, didn't God say something about this? He sure did. God himself warned Solomon twice to stop. But guess what? Even after all the divine wisdom, Solomon ignored him. So what happens when the man who had everything turns his back on the God who gave it all to him? Well, you'll want to hear this. Solomon's reign didn't just fade into obscurity, it crumbled. His kingdom, the one God promised to keep united, would soon be torn apart. His enemies rose, rebellion brewed, and his legacy? Let's just say it didn't end on a golden note. And here's where it gets really interesting. Because of Solomon's disobedience, God told him that his kingdom would be ripped from his family. Not during his lifetime, but after. And sure enough, the moment Solomon dies, his son Rehoboam takes the throne, and boom! 10 of the 12 tribes rebel. The once glorious kingdom of Israel shattered. At this point, Solomon was unstoppable. He wasn't just ruling Israel, he was transforming it into the crown jewel of the ancient world. His most famous accomplishment: the Temple of Jerusalem. This wasn't just any building, it was the place where God himself was said to dwell. People came from all over the world to marvel at this temple. And it wasn't just the architecture that made Solomon's kingdom the talk of the world. Imagine it. Solomon's reign was like living in a golden age. The dude had ships sailing to distant lands, bringing back treasures, spices, gold, and exotic animals. His court was filled with the finest things this world had to offer, and the nations around him, they weren't just allies, they were in awe. Kings and queens visited just to see if the rumors about Solomon were true. Even the famous Queen of Sheba made a legendary trip to meet the man herself. And spoiler alert, she was blown away. The Queen of Sheba herself said that Solomon's wisdom and wealth exceeded everything she had heard. Now, when a queen of an entire nation says you're more impressive than rumors say, you're next level. But here's the thing. When you're on top, it's easy to think you're invincible, right? And this is where things start to get complicated. The very success that made Solomon a legend also began to plant the seeds of his downfall. You see, As Solomon's wealth and power grew, so did his taste for more. And this desire for more wasn't just about gold or spices. It was about power, influence, and, here's the big one, foreign alliances. Now, you might be thinking, what's wrong with alliances? Isn't that smart diplomacy? And yeah, it was. But it came with a cost. A big cost. Solomon didn't just make deals with other nations. He married into them. He took foreign wives, lots of them, 700 wives and 300 concubines. And these weren't just any wives. They were princesses from nations who worshipped gods like Baal, Ashtoreth, and Molech. And here's the real kicker. Solomon didn't just marry these women. He let them bring their gods with them. This is where things start to unravel. The very king who built the temple for the one true God, the same man who spoke divine wisdom, allowed idols to be placed right alongside the temple of the Lord. The people started to worship these foreign gods. And what Solomon did next? You won't believe. Solomon, the man chosen by God, began to build altars for these gods to please his wives. This wasn't just a political move. This was outright disobedience. And that disobedience was about to have consequences that would tear the kingdom apart. So now, Solomon's kingdom is at its peak. The wealth, the alliances, the power, everything is in place. But while the world looks at Solomon and sees a king who's unstoppable, something far more dangerous is happening underneath the surface. The man who once wrote, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom," is now drifting further and further from that very truth. Here's the deal. Solomon's wisdom wasn't enough to protect him from the one thing he could never control: his heart. The foreign wives he married weren't just bringing idols into Israel. They were pulling Solomon into their worship. This wasn't a one-time thing. Slowly, over time, Solomon's loyalty to God began to crack. And here's where it gets real. Solomon, the wisest king on earth, started to follow these gods too. Can you believe that? The very man who was blessed with divine wisdom, who built God's temple, now bows before false gods like Molech and Chemosh. Yeah, that same Molech who was worshipped with child sacrifice. It's hard to even wrap your head around it, but it didn't stop there. Solomon started to build high places, altars and temples for these gods, all over Israel. He built these places for his wives, yes, but eventually he started offering sacrifices himself. Can you feel the weight of this? The king who once brought the people closer to God is now leading them down a path of spiritual destruction. And let me tell you something. You can't expect God to stand by and let this slide. God had warned Solomon twice. Do not follow other gods. He made it crystal clear. But Solomon, he turned away, and he kept going down this dark path. God finally had enough. He appeared to Solomon one last time, and this time it wasn't with a blessing. It was with a warning, a severe warning. Because you have turned away from me and have not kept my covenant, I will tear the kingdom away from you. Not in your lifetime, for the sake of David, but in your son's generation. The kingdom will be divided. Boom! There it is. The ultimate judgment. God tells Solomon, straight up, your disobedience is going to tear your legacy apart. The kingdom, the thing Solomon spent his life building, the thing God had promised to protect, would be ripped from his family's hands. And not only that, but the enemies of Israel were already rising. Enemies like Hadad, the Edomite, and Rezon of Zobah. These guys were rising against Israel, making Solomon's reign more unstable. And if that wasn't enough, there was a young man named Jeroboam, an official in Solomon's own government, who was about to play a major role in this prophecy. God was setting the stage for the kingdom to be torn apart, and Jeroboam would be the key player. So, where are we now? Solomon's heart is divided. His kingdom is on shaky ground, and God's judgment is clear. The kingdom will be torn apart. But here's the real question. How does the wisest king in history handle this brewing storm? Well, as we're about to see, even Solomon couldn't stop the inevitable. Here's where things start to fall apart for real. Solomon had ruled Israel in peace for decades, but now the cracks are everywhere. His alliances with foreign nations, his compromises on faith, his obsession with wealth, it's all catching up with him. And God wasn't the only one who saw the trouble brewing. Israel was about to face some serious political and domestic unrest. Let's talk about the enemies Solomon now had to deal with. First, there's Hadad, the Edomite, an old rival who had a serious grudge against Israel. He had escaped to Egypt as a child, but now he's back, and he's stirring up trouble in the southern part of Solomon's kingdom. Next up, Rezon of Zobah, a warlord who controlled parts of Syria and constantly raided Israel's northern territories. These guys weren't just thorns in Solomon's side. They were full-on threats to Israel's peace. And here's the kicker. These enemies weren't just a coincidence. The Bible says that God raised these enemies against Solomon as a consequence for his disobedience. Solomon was facing the direct results of turning away from God. But that wasn't even the worst of it, because now someone inside Solomon's own government was rising up against him. Meet Jeroboam. This guy was one of Solomon's top officials, trusted, skilled, and ambitious. But there was something special about Jeroboam. One day, as he's walking along the road, he meets the prophet Ahijah, who does something crazy. Ahijah takes off his cloak, tears it into 12 pieces, and hands 10 of them to Jeroboam. Now, you know what that means, right? Those 10 pieces represent 10 of the 12 tribes of Israel. Ahijah tells Jeroboam that God is giving him 10 tribes to rule after Solomon's death. Why? Because Solomon had turned away from God, and this was the judgment. Jeroboam was about to be the key figure in the division of Israel. And when Solomon got wind of this prophecy, he flipped. Solomon tried to kill Jeroboam. Yes, the same king who ruled with wisdom, now resorting to murder to stop what he thought was rebellion. But Jeroboam escaped to Egypt and waited for his moment. The prophecy was already in motion, and Solomon was powerless to stop it. So now, Solomon's once stable kingdom is in complete disarray. There are enemies on every side, a prophecy hanging over his head, and the fear that everything he's built is about to crumble the moment he dies.